I saw a portrait of Papa in the Ravenscroft study. Why do they have it?
You shouldn't have looked, Celine. I told you that house was just a job. I told you to keep your head down and your eyes on the floor.
Why did you lie to me? You said he died in a factory fire. You said the insurance company was the one sending those checks for my tuition.
It wasn't a lie to hurt you, baby. It was a lie to keep you alive.
The air in the Ravenscroft mansion is thick with secrets, but none as chilling as the one hidden behind a single gold frame. Celine Darnell thought she was just a maid, lucky to land a job with the city's most powerful family. But the moment she sees her dead father's face staring back at her from the Mafia boss's private study, her world shatters. Why is an ordinary worker enshrined in a den of killers? Stay tuned until the very end, because the truth behind that portrait will change everything you thought you knew about loyalty and blood. You won't believe the choice Odessa Ravenscroft forces Celine to make in the final moments of this story. If you're ready to dive into this web of shadows and high-stakes drama, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a chapter of this dark mystery. Papa. Celine's voice is a ghost of a whisper as the duster falls from her hand. Before she can even process the shock, the silk-clad Odessa Ravenscroft appears in the doorway like a beautiful omen of doom. He didn't die in an accident, Celine, Odessa says, her voice as cold as the diamonds at her throat. He died saving my husband's life. And now, it's time for you to learn exactly what you're worth to this family. The transition from the cramped, drafty apartment she shared with her mother to the sprawling, silent corridors of the Ravenscroft mansion felt less like a promotion and more like a descent into a beautifully gilded tomb. During her first week, Celine moved through the house like a ghost, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound on the hand-woven Persian rugs. On the surface, it was a dream. The pay was triple what she'd earned at the diner, and the labor, though meticulous, was physically light. But as the days bled into one another, the opulence began to feel suffocating. Every mirror she polished seemed to reflect a shadow that wasn't hers, and every vaulted ceiling felt like it was pressing down, holding its breath. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved her, it was the sensation of eyes. Whether she was buffing the silver in the dining hall or turning down the heavy velvet sheets in the guest wing, the prickle at the back of her neck never faded. She would spin around, expecting to see a security guard or perhaps the stern, silent housekeeper, but the hallways were always empty. Only the portraits of grim-faced ancestors and the flickering shadows of the heavy chandeliers bore witness to her work. The mansion was a fortress of marble and glass, yet Celine felt as though she were under a microscope, a specimen being studied by a predator that hadn't yet decided if it was hungry. Her interactions with Odessa were brief and surgically cold. The mistress of the house moved with a predatory grace, appearing in doorways without a sound, her glossy brown hair perfectly coiffed even at dawn. Odessa didn't give orders so much as she issued decrees, her dark eyes tracking Celine's every movement with a disturbing intensity. One afternoon, while Celine was dusting a collection of delicate jade figurines, she felt that familiar chill. She turned to find Odessa standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, backlit by the setting sun, her silhouette sharp and imposing. "You have your father's hand, Celine," Odessa remarked, her voice cutting through the quiet. Steady, precise. He never broke things he was meant to protect. Celine froze, the silk cloth clutched in her hand. "You speak as if you knew him for a lifetime, ma'am. But I was told he was just a man who did odd jobs." Odessa's lips curled into a faint, enigmatic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "In this house, there is no such thing as an odd job. Everything has a purpose. Everyone has a place. You're finding yours, aren't you?" Before Celine could press for more, Odessa swept out of the room, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and unanswered questions in her wake. That night, Celine lay in her small, pristine staff quarters, staring at the ceiling. She realized then that the Ravenscrofts didn't just hire her, they had collected her. The mansion wasn't just a place of employment, it was a cage, and the bars were made of the very gold she was paid to polish. She thought of her father's photo on the mantel, hidden away like a holy relic in a den of sin, and realized the accident that took him was only the first chapter of a story she was now forced to finish. The smell of cheap peppermint tea and medicinal liniment usually brought Celine a sense of home. But as she stepped into her mother's cramped apartment on her first night off, The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were sweating. Her mother, Elena, sat by the window, her silhouette frail against the neon glow of the streetlights. She looked older than she had just a week ago, her hands trembling as she knitted a sweater that never seemed to get any longer. Celine didn't wait for a greeting. She pulled the folded, grainy photocopy of the mansion's portrait from her pocket and smoothed it out on the laminate kitchen table. "I saw him, Mama," Celine said, her voice a low vibration in the small room. "Not in a dream. Not in the old album. I saw a portrait of Papa in the Ravenscroft study. It wasn't a snapshot. It was a tribute, gold-framed and placed right in the center of their lives." The clicking of the knitting needles stopped instantly. Elena didn't look at the paper. Instead, her eyes darted to the front door, then to the thin walls shared with their neighbors, as if the mere mention of the name Ravenscroft could summon a demon through the plaster. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a ghostly, translucent gray. "You shouldn't have looked, Celine," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. "I told you that house was just a job. I told you to keep your head down and your eyes on the floor. Why did you lie to me?" Celine pressed, leaning in, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You said he died in a factory fire. You said the insurance company was the one sending those checks every month for my tuition. But Odessa Ravenscroft looked at me like she owned me. She said Papa died saving her husband. She called it a debt." Elena let out a sharp, choked sob, finally looking at the photo. Her fingers brushed the image of her late husband's face, but she pulled back as if the paper were red hot. "It wasn't a lie to hurt you, baby. It was a lie to keep you alive. When your father, when he did what he did, they promised me you would be looked after. But that protection came with a price, silence. They told me if you ever found out the truth, the debt would be considered paid. And in that world, Celine, a paid debt means they don't owe you anything anymore. Not even your life." The terror in her mother's eyes was a physical weight, cold and suffocating. This wasn't just grief. It was the raw, jagged fear of a woman who had spent a decade looking over her shoulder. Celine realized then that the pension wasn't a gift of gratitude. It was a leash. Every meal they had eaten, every book Celine had bought for school, had been paid for in blood and enforced by a threat. "They're watching me, Mama," Celine said, the realization settling in her gut like lead. "In that house, I feel them everywhere." Elena grabbed Celine's wrists, her grip surprisingly strong, her knuckles white. "Then leave. Pack your bag and don't go back. We'll run. We'll find a way." But Celine looked back at the photo of her father. For the first time, she didn't just see a ghost. She saw a man who had been a soldier in a war she never knew existed. If she ran, she would spend the rest of her life in the same shadow that had consumed her mother. "I can't run," Celine whispered, her expression hardening into a mirror of the man in the frame. "If I'm the daughter of the man who saved the boss, then I'm not just a maid. I'm the only person in that mansion they can't easily get rid of. I'm going back, Mama. I need to know what he was really protecting." The storm that had been brewing over the city finally broke as Celine returned to the Ravenscroft estate, the rain lashing against the stone walls like a warning she was too stubborn to heed. The mansion was darker than usual, the grand foyer swallowed by long, jagged shadows that seemed to reach for her ankles. She bypassed the staff quarters and climbed the service stairs, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. Her mother's terror had changed something inside her. The air in the house no longer felt just heavy. It felt electric, charged with the static of a decade's worth of secrets. She was meant to be cleaning the gallery, but a low, rhythmic rumble drew her toward the master wing. It was the sound of a man's voice, deep and gravelly, vibrating through the heavy oak doors of the private parlor. Celine pressed herself into a recessed alcove, the cold stone biting into her back as she held her breath. "The girl is getting bold," Odessa, the man said. This was Julian Ravenscroft, the man whose face was never in the papers, but whose name was a death sentence in the underworld. She was in the study. She saw the portrait. "We should have buried that image along with him." "She has his eyes, Julian," Odessa's voice replied, smooth and devoid of the warmth she had mimicked earlier. "And she has his curiosity. It was only a matter of time." We've paid the Darnell debt for 10 years. We kept her fed, kept her educated, and kept her mother quiet. But if she starts digging into the accounts, she becomes a liability we can't afford. Celine's blood ran cold. The Darnell debt wasn't a matter of honor, it was a ledger entry. She heard the clink of glass against glass, a drink being poured, a decision being weighed. The girl thinks her father was a hero. Julian's voice dropped an octave, dripping with a dark, cynical amusement. She doesn't know that the night he saved me, he wasn't just a bystander. He was the one who set the fire that trapped us both. He saved me to cover his own tracks, and I kept him in that frame to remind myself that even the most loyal dog has a bite. Celine felt the world tilt. The image of the hero, the protector in the leather jacket, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Her father hadn't just been a servant to the mob. He had been an architect of their violence. The debt wasn't for his sacrifice. It was the price of his silence, a silence that had now been passed down to her. She's a maid, Julian, Odessa said, her tone sharpening. She cleans the floors. She doesn't have the stomach for the truth. If we see so much as a flicker of defiance, we handle it. The same way we handled the foreman who talked too much 10 years ago. A cold, hollow silence followed. Celine backed away, her movements mechanical, her mind racing. She wasn't just in a den of killers. She was in the home of the people who had owned her father's soul and were now waiting for a reason to claim hers. As she reached the safety of the dark hallway, she realized the night terrors weren't the shadows in the corner or the ghosts of the past. The real terror was the woman in the silk robe and the man behind the door, calculating the cost of her life over a glass of scotch. The velvet silence of the mansion's east wing felt like a physical weight against Celine's chest as she navigated the shadows, her breath shallow and controlled. The conversation she had overheard still echoed in her mind, a discordant melody that had stripped away the last of her innocence. Her father wasn't just a hero. He was a ghost bound by a contract of blood. If the Ravenscrofts were keeping a ledger on his life, it wouldn't be in the library or the study she had already cleaned. It would be in the vault, a room rumored among the staff to be a windowless sanctuary behind Julian Ravenscroft's dressing room, protected by a biometric lock and a decade of fear. Celine reached the heavy mahogany doors, her hands slick with a cold sweat that made the brass handles feel like ice. She didn't have a key, but she had something better. The knowledge of a daughter who had spent years watching her father tinker with intricate locks in their old workshop. He had always told her that every mechanism had a heartbeat, a rhythm you could feel if you listened closely enough. She knelt before the keypad, not pressing buttons, but examining the worn edges of the numbers. The 4, 7, and 9 were polished smoother than the rest, her father's old lucky numbers, or perhaps a date he could never forget. With a soft, mechanical click, the heavy door groaned open just an inch. The air that spilled out was stale, smelling of old paper and gun oil. Celine slipped inside, the beam of her small flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness like a scalpel. The room was lined with steel filing cabinets, each one a tombstone for a different family secret. She moved past folders labeled with names of politicians and rival syndicates until she found it, a slim, black leather binder tucked into the very back of the D drawer. Darnell, Thomas, asset number 402. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the light. She flipped the pages, skipping over maps of the city and technical schematics of the Ravenscroft warehouses. Then, she hit a section titled Contingency and Erasure. There was a photograph clipped to a report. Her father, looking younger, standing next to a burning car. The date matched the night of the factory fire, but the location was a pier 5 miles away. Beneath it was a handwritten note in Julian's jagged script. Darnell delivered the distraction. The witness is gone. Pay the widow until the girl comes of age. If the girl inherits his talent, she is to be recruited or removed. A sickening realization washed over her. Her father hadn't just saved Julian. He had been the one to silence the people who stood in the Mafia's way. The talent Julian referred to wasn't just fixing locks. It was the ability to move through the world unseen, to do the dirty work that kept empires standing. She wasn't just a maid. She was a legacy in waiting, a weapon they had been sharpening in the dark for 10 years. Suddenly, The floorboards outside the vault creaked. A sliver of light from the dressing room widened, casting a long, elegant shadow across the steel floor. Looking for your inheritance, Celine? Odessa's voice was devoid of its usual silk, replaced by a crystalline hardness that made the hair on Celine's neck stand up. The mistress of the house stood in the doorway, a small, silver pistol held casually at her side, her expression one of disappointed pity. The investigation was over. The hunt had begun. The silence in the vault was heavier than the steel walls surrounding it. Odessa didn't fire. She simply watched, her presence a cold, suffocating shroud as Celine clutched the black leather binder to her chest. The small silver pistol in Odessa's hand wasn't pointed at Celine's heart, but rested against her own silk-clad thigh, a casual reminder of who held the power in this room of ghosts. You look disappointed, Celine, Odessa said, her voice dropping into a low, haunting melodic tone. Did you expect to find a hero's medal? Or perhaps a map to a hidden fortune? Celine's eyes stung, the ink on the pages blurring beneath the harsh beam of her flashlight. Asset number 402, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. You didn't just pay for my school. You didn't just help my mother. You bought my father's hands so he could burn down lives. You turned him into a monster. Odessa stepped into the vault, the click of her heels echoing like a countdown. She reached out, her manicured fingers plucking a ledger from a shelf near Celine's head. She flipped it open to a page marked with a familiar date, Celine's 16th birthday. Look at the numbers, child, Odessa commanded. That laptop you used to study? It was paid for by a protection fee from a shopkeeper who couldn't afford his rent. Your mother's heart medication? That came from the interest on a loan we gave to a man who eventually lost his house to us. Every good thing you've ever touched, every milestone you celebrated, was built on the bones of people who weren't as lucky as you. Celine felt a wave of nausea. She looked down at her own hands, the hands Odessa had praised for being steady. She had always been proud of her education, of the fact that she had climbed out of the gutter despite her father's death. But now, she saw the invisible strings. She wasn't a self-made woman. She was a project. A long-term investment by a criminal empire that didn't believe in charity, only in leverage. My mother knew, Celine realized, her voice trembling with a new, sharper kind of grief. She didn't just take the money to survive. She took it to keep me oblivious. She traded the truth for my comfort. She traded the truth for your safety. Odessa corrected, leaning in so close that Celine could smell the expensive jasmine on her skin. But the comfort was a byproduct. We wanted you untainted, Celine. We wanted a Darnell with clean hands and a sharp mind, ready to serve the family when the time came. Your father was the shadow. We intended for you to be the light that masks our business. But you've ruined that now. You've reached into the darkness, and the darkness has a way of staining everything it touches. The weight of the realization crushed the last of Celine's hope. She wasn't just working in a mansion. She was living inside the belly of the beast that had swallowed her father whole. The gold on the walls, the silk on her bed, the very blood in her veins felt tainted by the blood money that had paved her way. As Odessa's cold gaze remained fixed on her, Celine realized that her life hadn't been a struggle for survival. It had been a 10-year audition for a role she never wanted to play. The click of the vault door sealing shut behind Odessa sounded like the falling blade of a guillotine. The space, once a sanctuary of secrets, had become a pressurized chamber where the air felt too thin to breathe. Celine stood paralyzed, the black binder still clutched to her chest, a paper shield against a woman carved from ice and diamonds. The silver pistol in Odessa's hand didn't waver. It remained a silent participant in the conversation, an extension of the authority that had governed Celine's entire life from the shadows. You were always meant to be the crown jewel of our investment, Celine, Odessa said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. She stepped closer, the light from Celine's fallen flashlight casting long, monstrous shadows against the steel filing cabinets. Your father was a blunt instrument, a man of fire and grease. But you? We gave you the best schools, the best doctors, the finest life a maid's daughter could dream of. We didn't do that out of guilt. We did it because a Darnell who can navigate a ballroom is worth 10 times more than one who can only hotwire a car. You didn't give me a life, Celine spat, her voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and betrayal. You grew me like a crop. You waited for me to be useful, so you could harvest the debt my father supposedly owed you. But he didn't owe you anything. He gave you his life. Odessa's laugh was short and sharp, a jagged shard of glass. He gave us his life because he had already sold it. The night of the fire, your father didn't just save Julian. He was tasked with eliminating a witness, a man who had proof of my husband's involvement in the Dockside massacre. Your father succeeded, but he got greedy. He tried to keep a copy of the evidence for himself, as insurance. That portrait in the study, it's not a memorial, Celine. It's a trophy, a reminder to Julian that even his best man tried to betray him. The revelation hit Celine like a physical blow. The hero in the leather jacket, the man who had tucked her in and smelled of peppermint and wood smoke, had been a blackmailer, a murderer. The world tilted on its axis, the moral compass she had followed her whole life spinning wildly until it broke. So why am I here? Celine asked, her voice hollow. If he betrayed you, why keep us alive at all? Odessa reached out, her cold fingers tilting Celine's chin upward, forcing her to look into eyes that had seen 1,000 deaths and remained unblinking. Because the evidence he stole was never found. He died with the location in his head, or so we thought. But your mother, she suggested that he might have left a roadmap for the only person he ever truly loved. You. Odessa leaned in, the scent of her jasmine perfume suddenly cloying, like flowers at a funeral. The confrontation is over, Celine. The truth is bare. You are not a guest, and you are no longer just a maid. You are the key to a vault much larger than this one. You will find what he hid, or you will find out exactly how we handle bad investments. Odessa stepped back, the silver pistol finally rising to point directly at Celine's brow. The cold metal reflected the flickering light, a final, lethal punctuation mark to the life Celine had known. The truth hadn't set her free. It had shackled her to the very throne she had spent a week polishing. The heavy click of the vault door unlocking from the outside signaled a change in the air, a shift from the cold, psychological warfare of Odessa to the brutal, efficient reality of Julian Ravenscroft. When the door swung wide, the silhouette of the man who ruled the city's shadows filled the frame. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a businessman in a charcoal suit, but the way the light died around him told a different story. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at Celine, his eyes tracing the black binder in her arms with a weary, predatory boredom. She found it then, Julian said, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very steel of the walls. She found what we allowed her to find, Odessa replied, her posture shifting from aggressor to ally as she stepped to his side. But she doesn't have the location. She's stalling Julian. She thinks her father's ghost is going to protect her. Julian stepped into the vault, the space suddenly feeling microscopic. He reached out and took the binder from Celine's paralyzed grip. He didn't flip through the pages. He simply dropped it onto the floor. Your father was a craftsman, Celine. He knew how to build things that lasted, and he knew how to destroy things so they stayed buried. But he made one mistake. He thought his bloodline was a sanctuary. He thought I wouldn't touch the one thing he loved if he crossed me. Celine found her voice, though it felt like it was rising through broken glass. He didn't cross you. He saved you. You said it yourself. He died so you could live. He died because he became a liability, Julian corrected, his face inches from hers. Just as you have. You've seen the ledger. You've heard the truth. You aren't a clean Darnell anymore, Celine. You're a witness. And in my world, witnesses are just ghosts who haven't stopped breathing yet. He turned to Odessa, a silent communication passing between them that chilled Celine more than the silver pistol ever could. The car is waiting in the service courtyard. Take her to the old foundry. We'll make it look like the same accident her father supposedly had. A gas leak. A tragic fire. A daughter following in her father's footsteps to the very end. Wait, Celine gasped, backing into the cold filing cabinets. You need me. You said I was the key. Keys can be duplicated, or the locks can be smashed, Julian said, checking his watch as if her life were merely an appointment he was running late for. If the location of the evidence isn't in your head, perhaps it's buried in your mother's house. We'll check there once you're gone. The terror that had been a dull ache sharpened into a jagged blade. They weren't just going to kill her. They were going for her mother next. As two silent, mountain-like men in dark suits appeared in the doorway behind Julian, Celine realized the hit wasn't a possibility. It was an arrangement already in motion. They led her out of the vault. Her arms gripped so tightly her skin began to bruise. As they marched her through the dark, opulent halls of the mansion one last time, she saw her father's portrait on the mantel. In the flickering candlelight, his eyes no longer looked protective. They looked like a warning. The industrial outskirts of the city felt like a different planet, a jagged landscape of rusted iron and rotting concrete that stood in stark contrast to the velvet silence of the Ravenscroft mansion. The two men Julian had sent, shadows in cheap suits, shoved Celine into the center of the derelict foundry, the air thick with the smell of stagnant water and old grease. One of them began unscrewing a valve on a rusted gas line, the rhythmic hiss sounding like a snake preparing to strike. "Make it look like she was squatting," the taller one muttered, his voice devoid of any human empathy. A girl looking for a place to hide, lighting a match to stay warm. Poof! Just like her old man. Celine stood in the center of the room, her hands zip-tied behind her back, her heart hammering against her ribs. But as the panic threatened to swallow her, a memory flickered to life, not of the father who tucked her in, but of the man who had sat her down at the workbench when she was 7 and told her to feel for the weak point in every structure. "The world is held together by tension, Celine," he had whispered, his hand steady as he showed her how to snap a plastic restraint using nothing but the friction of her own clothes. "If you find the tension, you find the exit." As the men moved toward the far corner to set the timer on an incendiary device, Celine dropped to her knees. She didn't pray, she searched. She leaned her back against a jagged piece of rebar protruding from a concrete pillar. With a sharp, rhythmic sawing motion, she began to rub the zip ties against the rusted metal. The plastic bit into her wrists, drawing blood, but she didn't flinch. She counted the seconds in her head, the way her father had taught her to time a fuse. 20 seconds. The men were walking toward the heavy steel exit. 10 seconds. The smell of gas was overwhelming now, sweet and lethal. 5 seconds. The zip tie snapped. Celine didn't run for the door. She knew they'd be watching from the car. Instead, she dived toward the heavy iron casting pit in the center of the floor, a deep, soot-stained trench used for cooling metal. She remembered a sketch from the back of the black binder, a diagram of this very foundry. Her father hadn't just worked here, he had mapped it. There was an overflow pipe, a subterranean artery that led directly to the river. The spark hit the gas just as Celine rolled into the pit. The world turned into a deafening, white-hot roar. The shock wave slammed into her, the heat searing the air from her lungs, but the heavy iron lip of the pit shielded her from the worst of the blast. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the secondary explosions, the accident Julian had bought and paid for. Covered in soot and blood, Celine crawled into the narrow, damp darkness of the overflow pipe. The protector's daughter was no longer a project or an asset. She was a ghost who had learned how to walk through fire. As she emerged into the cold night air by the riverbank, her eyes weren't filled with tears, but with the cold, calculating light of the Ravenscrofts themselves. They had taught her that every debt must be paid, and now she was going back to collect. The silence that followed the explosion at the foundry was the loudest sound Celine had ever heard. Drenched in river water and coated in a layer of soot that felt like war paint, she didn't head for the police station or the hospital. She headed back to the one place they would never expect to see a ghost, the front door of the Ravenscroft mansion. The heavy oak doors were unlocked, the security team likely celebrating a job well done. Celine didn't sneak through the service entrance this time. She walked up the grand staircase, her wet boots leaving muddy, rhythmic prints on the white marble. When she reached the study, she found Julian and Odessa standing by the fireplace, the portrait of her father still keeping its silent vigil. They were sharing a quiet toast, the amber liquid in their glasses shimmering in the firelight. "You really should have checked the casting pit, Julian," Celine said, her voice a low. terrifying rasp that cut through the room like a piano wire. The glass in Julian's hand shattered on the hearth. Odessa spun around, her face losing its sculpted composure for the first time, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the girl she thought she had burned out of existence. Celine wasn't trembling anymore. She held a small, water-damaged flash drive she had retrieved from the overflow pipe. The map her father had hidden in the very infrastructure of the foundry. "My father didn't just keep insurance on you," Celine said, stepping into the light of the fire. "He kept a record of every politician you bought, every body you buried, and every cent of the Darnell debt you laundered through my mother's account. He didn't leave it for me to find a hero. He left it so I would have a weapon." Julian moved toward his desk, his hand reaching for the drawer where he kept his backup piece, but Celine didn't flinch. "If I don't check in with a specific contact every 24 hours, the contents of this drive go to the Federal Bureau and every rival family you've ever crossed," she said, her gaze fixed on Odessa. "You wanted to know if I inherited his talent. Well, here it is. I know how to disappear, and I know how to make sure you disappear with me." The power dynamic in the room shifted with the finality of a closing vault. Odessa looked at the girl in the ruined maid's uniform and saw not a servant, but a mirror. The golden cage had been dismantled from the inside. "What do you want?" Odessa whispered, her voice trembling with a rare, jagged edge of fear. "I want my mother moved to a villa in Italy, under a name you can't track," Celine commanded, her voice cold and absolute. "And as for me, I'm leaving this mansion. You will continue to fund the Darnell debt, but now, the interest is going to be much higher. I am the shadow you created, and from now on, you work for me." Celine turned her back on them, a gesture of supreme confidence that left the Mafia boss and his wife speechless in her wake. She paused at the mantel, looking at the portrait of her father one last time. She reached out and tipped the frame face down. She didn't need his ghost to protect her anymore. She had become the storm he had always warned her about. As she walked out of the mansion and into the dawn, the sun began to rise. But for the Ravenscrofts, the long night had just begun.